they thought it would never recover. A nation bombed into silence, a land scorched, poisoned, and broken. But in the heart of Southeast Asia, Vietnam was not dead. It was only sleeping, wounded, but not defeated. This is the story of how a devastated nation rose from the ashes of war to become one of the fastest growing economies in the world. It is a journey of resilience, of grit, of silent sacrifices behind every brick rebuilt and every rice field replanted. But how does a country rise when its land is burned, its people scattered, and its history rewritten by outsiders? This is the untold rebirth of Vietnam. They called it the American War, a conflict that lasted nearly 2 decades, left over 3 million dead, and reduced entire cities to rubble. Vietnam's soil was soaked with blood and Agent Orange. Its rivers ran dark with oil, mud, and memories. And its people, exhausted, displaced, grieving. For outsiders, it looked like the end. But in Vietnam, it was just the beginning of a long and painful rebirth. In 1975, the war officially ended. The last American helicopters lifted off the embassy rooftop in Saigon, and a stunned silence fell over the land. The capital of the South, once vibrant and modern, now stood eerily quiet. Its streets cracked, its buildings hollow, its future uncertain. The North had won the war, but now it had to win the peace. There were no celebrations, only questions. How do you rebuild a country when bridges are destroyed, farms are poisoned, and families are buried beneath both ideology and rubble? How do you feed a nation when the soil refuses to grow and international sanctions tighten like a noose? How do you move forward when you've just spent 20 years fighting to survive? The first years after the war were not years of recovery. They were years of survival. Food was rationed. Electricity was rare. Paper money became worthless. And so, the people turned to what they had always relied on: each other. In the quiet of the night, villagers shared bowls of rice and candlelight. Old soldiers became farmers. Women patched roofs with cloth and willpower. Children played among bomb craters, as if to reclaim joy from destruction. But beyond the ruins, there was still hope. A generation of survivors was rising, toughened by war, hardened by hunger, and united by an unshakable pride in their land. The world may have looked away, but Vietnam was quietly gathering strength. It was still poor, still broken, but never defeated. The fire had burned everything, except the will to rise again. And so began the hardest chapter of all. Not the war to resist, but the peace to rebuild. A nation standing in the smoke, facing the impossible question: how do we rise now? The war had ended, but the struggle for life had only just begun. In the years after 1975, Vietnam was technically at peace, but inside the country, survival became the new war. With the economy shattered, factories silent, and international aid frozen by embargo, the people were left with little more than faith. Everything was rationed. Rice, sugar, meat, if they were available at all, were distributed through government coupons. One bar of soap might be shared by an entire family for a month. A bottle of soy sauce refilled again and again with water and salt. People stood in line for hours, sometimes for nothing at all. They learned to stretch a single chicken into a week's worth of broth and hope. The countryside faced even harsher truths. Bomb craters still pocked the earth. Farmland lay barren, contaminated by dioxin. Farmers tried to grow crops, but even the rain felt poisoned. In cities, workers received wages in worthless currency. Bartering replaced money. Gold became the underground economy. People traded jewelry for rice, wedding rings for cooking oil. Then came the wave of boat people. By the late 1970s, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled by sea. Families squeezed into wooden boats, risking storms, pirates, starvation, for just a chance at something better. Some made it, many didn't. But all left behind. A country gasping for air, and yet, amid this suffocating poverty, there were moments of quiet bravery. Teachers still opened classrooms. Doctors still walked to clinics, even without medicine. Mothers carried water for miles just to boil rice that barely fed a child. And across the land, a strange defiance took root. We are still here. We will not fall. Behind closed doors, some began to whisper about change. They saw other Asian countries thriving, Korea, Japan, Singapore. And they asked, why not us? Why must we keep choosing ideology over survival? Why must our people keep suffering when all they want is food, work, and dignity? The questions grew louder, and in the shadows of hardship, a new idea began to form. In 1986, everything would change. But before the change came the hunger, the exodus, the quiet, unshakable will to survive. This was the fire beneath the surface that would fuel the rebirth to come. Mars 1986, a year that would divide history between survival and transformation. Inside meeting rooms thick with smoke and caution, Vietnam's leaders sat facing the harshest truth. The revolution could no longer feed the people. After years of famine, isolation, and failure, the dream of collective prosperity had become a nightmare. And the people were quietly slipping away, not just across oceans, but in their faith. They called it Đổi Mới, renovation. Not just a policy, but a reckoning. Vietnam would open its doors to private enterprise, to market forces, to the world. It was not easy. It was not certain, but it was necessary. The shift was slow and cautious, but it came. Suddenly, small businesses were legal. Street vendors, once arrested, were now tax registered. Farmers could sell their rice and keep the profits. A bag of cement no longer needed central approval. And for the first time in decades, hope began to return, not through ideology, but through opportunity. Across the country, a quiet revolution stirred. Mothers who once sewed uniforms for the war began sewing shirts for export. Former soldiers opened mechanic shops. Children sold snacks after school. And local markets, long suppressed, buzzed back to life. The economy didn't boom overnight, but it woke up. And when it did, so did the people. Then came a bold move. Vietnam opened to foreign investment. At first, no one came. The world was skeptical. Could a former battlefield become a business partner? But in 1988, something changed. A small group of South Korean businessmen arrived in Hanoi. They brought blueprints, steel, and one radical belief: Vietnam had potential. Soon after, others followed: Japan, Taiwan, Australia. They saw cheap labor, untapped markets, and a hungry population. But more than that, they saw resolve. Vietnam didn't just want recovery. It was chasing reinvention. Old factories reopened. New ones broke ground. Foreign investors taught business, and Vietnamese workers learned fast. Change was everywhere, and yet not loud. It moved through alleys, homes, and minds. Television showed Korean dramas, phones began to ring, people could fly abroad again, and Western jeans replaced old military khakis. It wasn't just the economy that was changing, it was identity. Đổi Mới was never perfect. Corruption still lurked, inequality widened. But it was working. People had rice. Shops had goods. The country had movement. For the first time, Vietnam wasn't just surviving, it was rising. But who was building this new Vietnam? It wasn't just policies, it was people. The silent builders, the dreamers, the risk-takers. And in the next chapter, we'll meet the ordinary heroes who shaped the extraordinary future. Rebirth does not come from speeches, it comes from people, from hands that build, from backs that bend, from minds that refuse to break. In the shadow of Đổi Mới, while economists talked about GDP and growth curves, millions of silent builders were already at work. They had no titles, no headlines. But without them, Vietnam's rise would have remained just a dream. In a small village outside Tay Binh, a war veteran named Minh opened a bicycle repair shop. He had no capital, only tools he welded by hand. His shop was a tarp nailed to a wall. But within 2 years, he employed 6 other veterans, and later, his sons would turn that repair shop into a motorbike dealership. Minh never called himself a businessman. He just wanted to feed his family and help his brothers in arms. In the Mekong Delta, a widow named Lan grew rice. Before Đổi Mới, she had to sell it to the state at prices too low to live on. After Đổi Mới, she sold it herself. She bought a second field, then a third. She hired neighbors, built an irrigation ditch, and by 1994, exported rice to Singapore. She never studied economics, but she understood value because she lived without it for too long. Then came the overseas Vietnamese, once called traders, now welcomed home as bridges to the world. Engineers, doctors, teachers. They returned with new ideas, new skills, and a fierce love for the homeland that never left them. They didn't just invest money. They invested belief in a country still learning how to believe in itself. Universities, once dusty with silence, began to stir. Professors returned from Russia, France, America. They brought books, computers, and a simple message to their students. Your mind is your revolution now. And from those classrooms, a new generation would rise. Fluent in code, in English, in ambition. Not all stories ended in success. Many failed. Many were cheated, silenced, forgotten. But these builders, they kept building. One stall, one loan, one sunrise at a time. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't march. But they were soldiers fighting a different kind of war. In 1995, Vietnam and the United States restored diplomatic ties. 20 years after the bombs fell, 2 former enemies shook hands. But the handshake was made possible not just by presidents, but by the silent builders, the farmers who planted again, the traders who crossed borders, the teachers who lit new minds. Vietnam was no longer crawling, it was walking on roads paved by millions of unsung heroes. But ahead lay a new frontier, the world stage, and Vietnam was ready to take its first bold step. By the late 1990s, Vietnam was no longer rebuilding in the shadows. It was rising, and the world had begun to notice. In 1995, It joined ASEAN. In 2000, it signed a bilateral trade agreement with the United States. And in 2007, Vietnam became a member of the World Trade Organization. Doors once sealed by war now opened with opportunity. Multinational companies arrived: Intel, Samsung, Canon, Nike. They didn't come for charity. They came because Vietnam worked. Cheap labor, yes. But more than that, discipline, adaptability, and hunger for growth. Vietnamese workers didn't just show up. They studied. They adapted. They improved. By 2010, Vietnam was one of the world's largest exporters of coffee, rice, and seafood. Its factories supplied smartphones, sneakers, and semiconductors. The streets of Hanoi buzzed with scooters and startups. Ho Chi Minh City became a skyline of ambition. Tourists returned, not for war memorials, but for beaches, food, and culture. A country once known for destruction was now known for determination. But it wasn't just economics. Vietnam began shaping diplomacy, too. It hosted world leaders, negotiated trade deals, balanced relations with China, the US, Russia, and ASEAN. From war zone to peace broker. A voice once silenced, now invited to the table. In 2017, Vietnam hosted APEC. In 2019, it hosted the US-North Korea Summit. Both events were peaceful, efficient, respected. And in every photo, behind every flag, was the quiet pride of a nation that once had nothing, but now had something to offer. Vietnamese students studied abroad in record numbers. Engineers returned to launch tech startups. Chefs opened fusion restaurants in New York and Paris. Fashion designers walked runways in Seoul and Milan. The world was no longer just watching Vietnam. It was collaborating with it. And through every success, echoed the memory of those who came before, those who planted rice, sold noodles, and never gave up. Of course, challenges remained. Corruption, environmental damage, inequality. But these were growing pains, not signs of failure. Vietnam was no longer trying to prove its worth. It was building it, step by step, factory by factory, story by story. But even as Vietnam rose on the world stage, new questions emerged. How do you grow without losing your soul? How do you modernize without forgetting where you began? The next generation would face a different kind of war, not of bombs and bullets, but of balance.